Hello everyone, this is Short Stories, and I'm your host, Martin. We will continue our exploration of the 1800s with today's short story, which is called Mary Barton. It's based on a novel by Elizabeth Gaskell called Mary Barton, A Tale of Manchester Life. It was published in 1848 and details the struggles of the urban working class in Victorian England. It is also a courtroom drama. You probably have not heard of Elizabeth Gaskell, but she was actually a very well-connected member of England's literary community. She was a personal friend of Charlotte Bronte. In fact, she wrote the official biography of Charlotte Bronte. Gaskell's most famous novels are Cranford, North and South, and Wives and Daughters. All of these have been turned into a BBC special at least once. Vocabulary: bloke, bloke. Harry Potter is a very nice bloke. See the glass as half empty or half full. See the glass as half empty or half full. Jim is a melancholy person who sees the glass as half empty. Suspect, suspect. Mr. Simpson is the prime suspect in the murder of Mr. Burns. Innocence, innocence. Bob was acquitted in court, but the general public never believed in his innocence. Evidence, evidence. The prosecutor presented evidence in court. Clue, clue. Sherlock Holmes checked the room carefully for clues. Alibi, alibi. Jane couldn't have committed the murder. She has an alibi. Gunwale, gunwale. The sailor rested on the gunwale as the ship left the dock. And now the story. A long time ago in the city of Manchester, there lived two families, the Wilsons and the Bartons. They were neighbors and close friends. The Wilson family included George Wilson, Jane Wilson, and their son, Jem. George's sister Alice also lived nearby and often came over for tea. The Barton family consisted of Mr. Barton, Mrs. Barton, and their daughter, Mary. Mr. Wilson and Mr. Barton became friends through work. They both worked at the same factory, which was owned by a wealthy industrialist named John Carson. Mr. Wilson was a rather optimistic bloke who liked to see the glass as half full. Mr. Barton was the opposite. He was the kind of person who saw the glass as half empty. He often complained about their boss. "Lousy rich people, what have they ever done for us working folk?" he grumbled. One day, Mrs. Barton's sister Esther went missing, which caused her a great deal of anxiety. Mr. Barton was worried that this would negatively impact her pregnancy, so he tried his best to keep her spirits up. Sadly, things took a turn for the worse a few weeks later. Tragically, Mrs. Barton died during childbirth. Mr. Barton was heartbroken and angry. He wanted someone to blame, so he blamed Esther for causing her distress, and he blamed his boss for not providing them with health insurance. Mr. Barton became gloomier after this tragedy, and he started attending union meetings, eventually becoming an active member of the labor movement. Mary changed too, but in a different way. Her father became more affectionate and more indulgent with her. "You're all I have left," he told her. Mary grew up to be very independent, but also a bit naive. She got a job at a dress shop and started hanging out with Alice Wilson. This put her in close contact with Jem Wilson, who was about the same age as Mary. Jem was a tall, strapping lad. He was also very clever with machines, so he decided to become a mechanic at Carson's factory. This made him the pride of the Wilson family. It was a sincere hope of Mr. and Mrs. Wilson that Mary and Jim would one day get married. "They'd make such a cute couple," exclaimed Mrs. Wilson. Jim hoped to get married to Mary, too. He had had a crush on her since they were 13 years old, but he was shy and never said anything about it to anyone. One day, while Mary was working in the dress shop, a special customer walked in. It was John Carson's son, Harry. Harry Carson was lean, handsome, and rich. Mary took a liking to him instantly. They met often after that. Harry arranged his schedule so that he could escort Mary home after work almost every day. Mary liked spending time with Harry, but more importantly, she liked the idea of being married to a rich man. "I'll live comfortably in a big house, and I'll be able to provide for Papa when he is old," she thought. Mary was no stranger to poverty, so it was understandable that she would dream of money. Jim took notice of what was happening, and he didn't like it. He started to feel jealous of Harry. He decided that he needed to overcome his bashfulness and make his move. On Mary's day off, Jim approached her, handed her a love letter, and said, "Mary, I love you. I've always loved you. Will you marry me?" Mary was embarrassed and shocked. She didn't know what to say. Although she was trembling from head to toe, she said in a calm voice, "I will always be your friend, Jim, but I can never be your wife." Jim was heartbroken. "Not my wife?" said Jim mournfully. "Oh, Mary, think it over first." But Mary stood firm. Jim's emotions got the better of him, and he cried and shouted, "It's your cruelty that will have made me what I feel I shall become." And he slammed the door on his way out. This episode disturbed Mary deeply, as you can imagine. She cried for about an hour before she collected herself enough to contemplate what had happened. She read Jim's love letter and cried some more. She wasn't sure that she had made the right choice. She definitely had feelings for Jim, but were those feelings of romantic love? Mary decided that she needed time to think, so she cooled things off with Harry. She left work early to avoid seeing him. A few days later, Mary read something truly terrible in the morning newspaper. Harry Carson was murdered. Mary's eyes widened and her face grew pale. She read on and learned that Jim Wilson was the primary suspect. Mary wept uncontrollably. It took some time for Mary to get a hold of herself, but when she did, she immediately went to the Wilsons' house to talk to Jim. It was too late. Jim was arrested and awaiting a speedy trial. Mary couldn't believe that Jim was a murderer. She wiped the tears from her eyes and declared, "Mr. Wilson, I will prove your son's innocence." Mary immediately went to work to solve the case. She first inquired about the details of the murder. The night before the murder, Jim had confronted Harry on the street. Witnesses positively identified both men. "They were fighting over some girl," said one witness. At the crime scene itself, the police had recovered a pistol, which they later confirmed belonged to Jim Wilson. Under pressure from John Carson, the police acted quickly and arrested Jim without looking for any further evidence. "It's an open and shut case," asserted the police superintendent. Mary was not convinced. She went to the crime scene herself to have a look. At the scene of the murder, Mary searched for clues, but found none. She was becoming discouraged when she was approached by a strange, disheveled woman. "Mary Barton," said the odd woman, "I have something for you." She handed Mary a wadded-up piece of scorched paper. "How do you know my name?" asked Mary. The strange woman revealed herself to be her Aunt Esther. "I heard about the murder and came here myself," she explained. "I found this piece of paper, which I reckon was used for the wadding in the gun. I've seen this kind of thing before." Mary took the paper and flattened it. She suddenly grew stiff, as if petrified by some horror abruptly disclosed. It was unmistakable. This was a piece of the love letter that Jim had written to her. Esther decided to leave and said, "Good night, my sweet Mary. Good luck to you." Mary now had a piece of evidence that Jim was innocent. There was no way Jim could have used the love letter as wadding for the gun because it was still in her desk. "The desk!" Mary exclaimed. She ran home and up to her room. The letter was gone. But who could have taken it, she wondered. Then a sudden and terrible realization entered Mary's mind. Her father was the murderer. He was the only one to have access to her room during the time before the murder. As fearful as she was, she had to find confirmation. She searched the pockets of her father's coat and found the rest of the letter. One of the corners had been ripped off. "So it's true," lamented Mary. "What do I do now? If I show this to the police, Jim will be saved, but Papa will be executed." Mary decided to keep the paper a secret. The thought of Jim rotting in jail tore at Mary's heart. She had to save him, but she didn't know how. "If only I could find an alibi for him," she thought. Mary went straight to Alice Wilson's house the next day. She asked her all kinds of questions about Jim's comings and goings on the night of the murder. Alice hadn't seen him at all that night. "He was out with some friends," she said. "Who?" demanded Mary. The only name Alice knew was Will Wilson, Jim's cousin. "He left for Liverpool yesterday," said Alice. "He's scheduled to go to sea tomorrow." Mary had no time to lose. She grabbed what little money she had and raced to the nearest railway station. Mary made it to Liverpool that evening. It was too late to do anything, as darkness had settled across the dangerous streets of Liverpool. "This is not the time or place to go looking for Will," Mary said to herself, "or I might become a murder victim myself." Mary rented a room at the nearest inn and made plans to catch up with Will at the docks the next morning. Morning came, and Mary hurried out the door of the inn. When she reached the docks, she was overwhelmed with the flurry of activity. It was not even 6 a.m. yet, and the harbor was wide awake. "How will I find Will in this mess?" Mary said to herself. She found the harbor master and asked about Will's ship, the John Cropper. The harbor master pointed at a ship that was just pushing off the dock. "Stop!" shouted Mary as she ran alongside the ship. A man looked down at her from the gunwale. "Oh, is Will Wilson here?" she asked. The man disappeared. A few seconds later, another man peered over the gunwale. "Are you Will Wilson?" shouted Mary. The man waved, but Mary couldn't hear his voice over the noise of the harbor. "You need to come back to Manchester," she bellowed. "Jim needs your help or he will die." By now the ship was several yards from the dock and quickly sliding into the open ocean. Mary felt like Jim's life was slipping out of her own hands. She bit her lip and pulled her hair out of despair and frustration. "What do I do now?" she thought. What will Mary do next? Will she be able to save Jim without exposing her father's guilt? To find out how the story ends, go to Gutenberg.org to read the original story yourself. And now the questions. Number 1. How did Mr. Wilson and Mr. Barton meet? A. They met at church. B. They met at school. C. They met at a union meeting. D. They met at work. The answer is D. They met at work. Question 2. Who was Jim Wilson's alibi? A. Mary Barton. B. Alice Wilson. C. Harry Carson? D. Will Wilson? The answer is D. Will Wilson, his cousin. Question 3. What clue did Mary get from Esther? A. A pistol. B. A coat. C. A piece of paper. D. A photograph. The answer is C. A piece of paper. Question 4. Who murdered Harry Carson? A. John Carson. B. Mary Barton. C. Mr. Barton. D. Jem Wilson. The answer is C. Mr. Barton, Mary Barton's father.